The restaurant was alive with movement, servers weaving between tables, plates clinking, quiet conversations blending into a low hum. It wasn't a high-end place, but it had charm. The kind of spot where regulars knew the staff by name, where the smell of fresh bread hit you the moment you walked in. Ethan had worked here for 2 years. He knew the rhythm of the place, the way to balance a tray with one hand while dodging a distracted customer, the exact amount of small talk that made guests feel welcome without slowing him down. But tonight, something felt different. A man sat alone at table 7, a booth near the window. He was dressed well, sharp suit, no tie, someone who looked like he belonged in a boardroom more than a casual dining spot. He had been sitting there for nearly an hour, barely touching his meal. Ethan stole another glance as he refilled a water glass at a nearby table. The man wasn't just sitting. He was watching, not in a creepy way, but in a way that made Ethan hyper-aware of everything he was doing, every step, every interaction. Like he was being evaluated. He pushed the thought aside and kept moving. The kitchen was a furnace of motion, orders being shouted, the grill sizzling, the sharp scent of onions and garlic thick in the air. Ethan grabbed a tray and balanced 3 plates, nodding to the cook before heading back out. As he passed by the booth, the man finally spoke. "You seem like you know what you're doing." Ethan stopped, surprised. He turned, offering his practiced, polite smile. "I'd like to think so." The man studied him. "How long have you worked here?" 2 years, Ethan said. "Started part-time during school, then full-time after." The man raised an eyebrow. "School?" Ethan hesitated. "Yeah, well, I had to put it on pause." The man didn't press, just nodded. "You like it here?" Ethan gave a half-smile. "It's a job." The man chuckled. "Fair answer." He glanced at his watch. "I have a meeting nearby, but I'll need the check soon." Ethan nodded, moving to grab the bill, but before he could take another step, a crash. A shout. Ethan turned just in time to see a man stumble from the bar area, knocking over a chair. His movements were clumsy, sluggish, clearly drunk. The manager, Rebecca, rushed over, hands raised in a calming gesture. "Sir, I think you've had enough for tonight." The man swayed, then suddenly lunged, grabbing her wrist. Ethan moved before he even thought about it. He crossed the room in seconds, stepping between them. "Hey," Ethan kept his voice firm but even. "You need to let go." The drunk man's grip tightened. His face was flushed, eyes unfocused, but there was something mean behind them. Ethan felt his own pulse quicken. He had seen this before. Some people just didn't let go. The restaurant had gone quiet. Every set of eyes was locked on them. Ethan took a slow breath. This was a risk. If this went wrong, he could lose his job. But he wasn't about to just stand there. With steady hands, he reached for the drunk man's wrist. "Let go now." The man blinked, disoriented, then, finally, released his grip. Rebecca took a step back, rubbing her wrist. "All right," Ethan said. "Let's get you a cab." The man grumbled something under his breath, but he didn't resist as Ethan guided him toward the door. Within minutes, it was over. The restaurant let out a collective breath. Rebecca gave Ethan a grateful nod before heading back to the counter. Conversation started up again, the tension fatting. Ethan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Then he noticed table 7. The man in the suit was still watching, but this time there was something different in his expression, something like approval. When Ethan returned with the man's bill, the man didn't take it. Instead, he slid a business card across the table. "Come by this address tomorrow morning," he said. Ethan frowned. The card was simple, just a name and an office address in the city. No company logo, no title. He looked back up. "What is this?" The man finally smiled. "An opportunity." Ethan hesitated. This could be nothing, or it could be everything, and right now he had nothing to lose. He slipped the card into his pocket. "I'll be there." The man nodded, finally pulling out his wallet to pay. As Ethan turned away, he had the strangest feeling. That his entire life had just changed, and he didn't even know it yet. Ethan stood outside the address on the business card, staring up at the towering glass building. It looked expensive. The kind of place where people wore suits that cost more than his monthly rent. He shifted on his feet, suddenly aware of his second-hand jacket and the scuffed edges of his sneakers. This was a mistake. Maybe the guy from the restaurant had been messing with him. Maybe he was walking into some elaborate joke. But then he remembered the way the man had looked at him after the incident. Not just watching, assessing. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped inside. The lobby was pristine, polished floors gleaming under soft overhead lights. A woman at the reception desk glanced up as he approached. "Can I help you?" Ethan hesitated, then pulled out the business card. "I was told to come here." She took the card, her expression unreadable as she examined it. Then, without a word, she picked up the phone and dialed. A few seconds later, she nodded. "Take the elevator to the top floor. Someone will be waiting." Ethan swallowed. Top floor, he nodded his thanks and headed toward the elevator. The ride up was smooth, silent, but his mind was anything but. Who was this guy? And why did he want Ethan here? When the doors slid open, he stepped into a sleek, modern office space. Floor-to-ceiling windows lined the walls, offering a stunning view of the city. And standing there waiting for him was the man from the restaurant. Except now, he wasn't just some guy in a suit. He was the CEO. Ethan blinked. "I see you came," the man said, stepping forward. Ethan nodded, still processing. Yeah, I did." The man extended a hand. "David Calloway." Ethan hesitated before shaking it. The name tickled at something in the back of his mind. Then it hit him. David Calloway, as in Calloway Enterprises, as in one of the most influential business figures in the city. Ethan had just served him a plate of pasta last night. David gestured toward a seating area. "Have a seat." Ethan sat, feeling painfully out of place. David didn't waste time. "Do you know why I asked you here?" Ethan shook his head. "Not really." David leaned forward slightly. "I've been looking for someone." That caught Ethan off guard. "Someone for what?" David studied him for a moment. "Someone who doesn't hesitate to do the right thing, even when there's risk involved." Ethan frowned. "Look, if this is about what happened at the restaurant." "It is," David interrupted. "I watched how you handled that situation. You didn't freeze. You didn't back down, and you didn't let fear stop you from stepping in." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "I mean, it was that big of a deal." David's gaze sharpened. "You think so? Then tell me how many other people stepped in." Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it, because the answer was 0. David nodded as if he already knew what Ethan was thinking. "You didn't wait for someone else to act. That's rare." Ethan exhaled. "Okay, so what does that have to do with me being here?" David leaned back. "I built my company from the ground up. I know talent when I see it." Ethan's stomach twisted. "If this is some kind of job offer," David held up a hand. "It's not." Ethan blinked. "Then what is it?" David's expression softened. "Tell me, Ethan, why did you put school on pause?" Ethan felt his shoulders tense. "That's personal." David didn't press, just waited. After a long pause, Ethan sighed. "Money. I couldn't afford tuition anymore." David nodded as if he expected that answer. "What were you studying?" Ethan hesitated, then admitted, "Engineering." David's eyes lit up. "And that's what you want to do?" Ethan clenched his jaw. "It was what I wanted, but it doesn't matter now." David tilted his head. "Why not?" Ethan let out a short laugh. "Because dreams don't mean much when rents do." David was silent for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. He placed it on the table between them. Ethan eyed it warily. "What's that?" David folded his hands. "Open it." Ethan hesitated, then slowly picked it up, sliding a finger under the flap. When he pulled out the paper inside, his breath caught. It was a full-ride scholarship, for any university of his choosing. His hands tightened around the paper. I don't understand." David met his eyes. "I told you. I've been looking for someone who deserves an opportunity but hasn't been given one." Ethan's throat felt dry. And you just do this. For random people, David smiled slightly. No, I do this for the right people. Ethan swallowed. This is insane. David's expression turned serious. No, Ethan. What's insane is that people like you, hardworking, capable, driven, are forced to give up their futures just because they weren't handed a silver spoon. Ethan stared at the scholarship letter. It didn't feel real. Why me? He asked quietly. David leaned forward. Because I used to be you. Ethan looked up sharply. David gestured out toward the city skyline. I wasn't born into this. I worked minimum wage jobs. I scraped by. I almost gave up too. His voice softened, but someone took a chance on me. Ethan felt his chest tighten. So now, David continued, I take chances on people like you. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, mind racing. This was too much. Too fast, he should say no. It was too good to be true. But as he sat there holding that letter for the first time in years, hope flickered in his chest. A real shot, a way out, a future. David's voice cut through his thoughts. You don't have to answer now. Think about it, but if you do take it, he held Ethan's gaze. Don't waste it. Ethan nodded slowly, his heart pounding. He didn't know what he was going to do, but one thing was certain. His life had just changed. Again. Ethan sat at his tiny apartment's kitchen table, the scholarship letter in front of him. The edges were already worn from how many times he had unfolded and refolded it, as if checking to make sure it was still real. It didn't feel real. 2 years ago, he had walked away from school, telling himself it was temporary. He had convinced himself that he'd find a way back, that things would work out. They hadn't. Bills piled up. His mother got sick. His savings vanished. And now, out of nowhere, someone had handed him a second chance. No strings, no catch. At least that's what David had said. Ethan exhaled and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. It had to be too good to be true. By the next evening, he still hadn't made a decision. He worked his shift at the restaurant like usual, but his head wasn't in it. His movements felt automatic, smile, take orders, carry plates. But his mind was still in David's office, replaying that conversation over and over. When his shift ended, Rebecca, his manager, pulled him aside. You good? She asked. You've been weird today. Ethan forced a smile. Yeah, just got a lot on my mind. She eyed him, then crossed her arms. This about that suit guy from the other night. Ethan blinked. How'd you? She smirked. Ethan, you are the worst at hiding things. You had that deer in headlights look when he left his card. Ethan sighed. Yeah, it's about him. Rebecca leaned on the counter. And Ethan hesitated. He offered me something, a scholarship. Rebecca's eyebrows shot up. Seriously, he nodded. She let out a low whistle. Damn, and you're hesitating why? Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. Because it doesn't make sense. People don't just do things like this. Rebecca tilted her head. You sure about that? He frowned. What do you mean? She shrugged. Not everyone's out to get something. Maybe he just believes in you. Ethan scoffed. That's a little much, don't you think? Rebecca rolled her eyes. Look, I don't know the guy, but I do know you, and I know you want this. Ethan clenched his jaw. Rebecca softened. Ethan, you're one of the smartest people I know. You don't belong here forever. That hit him harder than he expected. I don't know, he muttered. Rebecca sighed. Well, think fast. Opportunities don't sit around waiting. She patted his shoulder, then left him standing there, still staring at nothing. Ethan found himself outside David's office again the next morning. He wasn't even sure how he got there. He had just walked, lost in thought, and now he was here. His feet had made the decision before his brain did. He took a deep breath, then stepped inside. The receptionist from last time nodded at him. He's expecting you. That threw him off. He hadn't even called ahead. Still, he didn't question it, just took the elevator up. David was waiting when the doors opened. You came, he said simply. Ethan exhaled. Yeah. David gestured for him to follow, leading him back to his office. The city stretched out beyond the glass windows, sunlight casting long shadows across the room. David sat folding his hands on the desk. "So," Ethan hesitated, "I don't get it." David nodded as if he had expected that. "You think it's too good to be true?" Ethan nodded. David leaned back. "Let me tell you something. When I was younger, I got a similar offer. Someone saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself." Ethan frowned, and I almost turned it down. David smiled slightly. "I told myself all the same things you're telling yourself now. That it was a trap, that I didn't deserve it, that I wasn't good enough." Ethan swallowed. David leaned forward. "But here's the thing, opportunities don't wait. You either take them or you don't. And if you do," his voice softened, "you might regret it for the rest of your life." The weight of that statement settled deep in Ethan's chest. He had already given up on this dream once. Could he really do it again? David watched him for a long moment, then pulled something out of his desk, a pen. He slid it across the desk. "Sign the letter, Ethan." "Say yes." Ethan's fingers hovered over it. This was it. If he signed, there was no turning back. No excuses, no running. He would have to succeed. His pulse pounded in his ears. Then slowly, he picked up the pen and signed. David smiled. "Good choice." Ethan exhaled, the weight on his shoulders shifting into something else, something that felt a lot like hope. That night, he went back to the restaurant for what would be one of his last shifts. Rebecca caught him at the back, leaning against the counter. "So?" Ethan grinned. "I signed." She broke into a wide smile. "Hell yeah, you did." He chuckled. "Yeah, guess I'm really doing this." Rebecca nudged his shoulder. "You deserve it, Ethan, don't forget that." For the first time in a long time, he believed her. Ethan's world shifted overnight. One moment, he was grinding away at double shifts, drowning in bills, feeling like his life had no way forward. The next, he was starring at an acceptance packet for one of the best business schools in the country. And the scariest part, he had no idea if he was ready. The reality of what he had signed up for hit him fast. There were forms to fill out, emails from advisors, student portals filled with deadlines, and an overwhelming amount of information about courses, housing, and orientation. It was happening. It was really happening, and the fear started to creep in. David had told him there would be no catch, no hidden agenda. And so far, he had kept that promise. Ethan had expected some kind of contract, maybe one that tied him to David's company after graduation or something, but nothing like that came. Just a simple agreement stating that his tuition, housing, and a small stipend would be covered. No repayment, no fine print. Ethan sat at the kitchen table staring at the letter. It still didn't feel real. His mom shuffled into the room, her robe pulled tight around her thin frame. She had been sick for a long time, and while she was stable now, she wasn't the same as before. She glanced at him. "You're reading that letter again." Ethan huffed a small laugh. "Maybe." She sat across from him. "Still doesn't feel real." He nodded. His mom reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "You earned this, Ethan." He looked down. "I don't know if I did." She gave him a knowing look. "You've worked harder than anyone I know." This was never about deserving. This was about opportunity. And now that you have it, you need to take it. Ethan exhaled. It was one thing to sign the letter. It was another to actually go through with it. The last day of his restaurant job was surreal. Rebecca had gathered everyone before his shift ended, and to Ethan's surprise, the entire staff had pitched in to get him a small send-off. A cake, a card, and way too many embarrassing stories about him. He laughed, felt grateful, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving something behind. "You gonna miss us?" Rebecca teased, nudging him as they stood outside after closing. Ethan smirked. "Depends, you guys gonna miss me." Rebecca rolled her eyes, obviously. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Rebecca turned serious. "You scared?" Ethan hesitated. "Yeah," she nodded. "Good. That means it's worth it." Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. He wasn't just leaving a job. He was leaving behind the life he had known and stepping into something completely unknown. Move-in day came faster than he expected. David had arranged everything, a fully furnished dorm, all expenses covered, and even a new laptop waiting for him. It was too much. He wasn't used to people giving him things. Still, as he unpacked, he felt something stir in his chest. Excitement. For the first time in years, his future didn't feel like a dead end. There were people here who didn't know him as the guy who had to drop out. They didn't know his past. Here he could be someone new, and that both thrilled and terrified him. His first class was a wake-up call. Ethan had always been smart, but being smart and being prepared were two different things. He had barely sat down before the professor launched into complex theories and business strategies that went completely over his head. Around him, other students nodded, took notes effortlessly, and seemed to understand every word. Ethan, he felt like he was drowning. By the end of the lecture, he had a headache. As he packed up, a student next to him glanced over. "First year?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah." The guy grinned. "You looked like your soul left your body about 20 minutes in." Ethan let out a breathy laugh. "That obvious?" The guy extended a hand. "Zach, also a first year." "Also suffering?" Ethan shook it. "Ethan." Zach smirked. "We should probably start a study group before this class actually kills us." Ethan chuckled. "Yeah. Probably." For the first time that day, he felt a little less alone. The weeks that followed were intense. Ethan spent hours in the library trying to catch up on everything he didn't know. He forced himself into study groups, asked questions even when he felt stupid, and slowly, very slowly, started to keep up. David had been right. This was an opportunity, but it was also a test. Ethan wasn't just trying to prove something to the school. He was trying to prove something to himself, that he deserved to be here, that he belonged, and he wasn't going to waste it. David checked in occasionally. Not too much, just enough. Ethan appreciated it. One evening, after a particularly brutal exam, David sent a simple text, "How's it going?" Ethan stared at the screen before replying, "Hard, but good." A pause. Then another message came through. "That's how you know it's worth it. Keep pushing." Ethan exhaled. He would, because for the first time in a long time, his life was moving forward. Ethan adjusted his backpack and exhaled, staring at the library doors in front of him. He had been here nearly every night since classes started, and yet the feeling never changed. Every time he sat down, opened his laptop, and started reviewing materials, he felt like he was sprinting just to keep up. It wasn't that he didn't understand the material, it was that everyone else seemed so far ahead. Zach had joked once that half the students here had parents who owned companies or had been prepping for business school since they were kids. Ethan didn't have that. He had late-night shifts, unpaid bills, and years of self-doubt to fight against. But he was here, and he wasn't going to waste it. Zach slid into the chair across from him. "Okay, tell me you bombed that finance quiz too." Ethan groaned. It wasn't a bomb, but it wasn't great either. Zach dropped his bag. "Cool, so we both suck." Ethan smirked. "I don't suck, I'm just struggling." Zach waved a hand. "Same thing." Ethan shook his head, but he couldn't deny the exhaustion creeping in. "How do these people make it look so easy?" he muttered. Zach shrugged. Years of prep schools, trust funds, and parents who probably hired private tutors the second they could read. Ethan sighed. "Dude," Zach said, leaning forward. "We're here, we're in this, we just need to work twice as hard." Ethan nodded slowly. It wasn't fair, but he had never expected it to be. The next few weeks blurred together. Late nights, study sessions, barely enough time to breathe. Ethan pushed himself harder than ever. He was the first one in the library every morning, the last one out every night. If he wasn't in class, he was reading. If he wasn't reading, he was taking notes. He had been given a once-in-a-lifetime chance, and failure wasn't an option. One afternoon, David called. Ethan hesitated before answering. He hadn't spoken to him since move-in, not because he didn't want to, but because he felt like he needed to prove himself first. "Ethan," David's voice came through, steady as always. "How's it going?" Ethan exhaled. "Good, hard but good." David chuckled. "That's expected." There was a brief silence, then David asked, "Are you keeping up?" Ethan hesitated. Was he? Most days it felt like he was hanging on by a thread, but quitting wasn't an option. "I will," he said firmly. David paused, then said, "I believe you." The words landed harder than Ethan expected. After they hung up, he sat there for a long time staring at his phone. People didn't say things like that to him often, and for the first time he wanted to earn it. The pressure started to build. Assignments piled up and midterms loomed. Ethan barely slept. One night Zach caught him staring at his laptop, rubbing his temples. "Dude," Zach said, "you okay?" Ethan blinked. "Yeah, why?" Zach gave him a look. "Because you've been in the same spot for 6 hours and I'm pretty sure you haven't blinked." Ethan sighed, "Just trying to keep up." Zach nodded. "I get it." A beat passed, then he added, "But you will burn out if you don't step back." Ethan clenched his jaw. He couldn't step back, not now, not when he was so close. Midterms arrived faster than expected. Ethan sat in the exam room, fingers gripping his pen. He had studied for this, prepared. But the second the paper hit his desk, his mind went blank. Panic crept in. For a split second, all he could hear was his own heartbeat. Then he took a slow breath. Focus. One question at a time. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about finishing. And so he started writing. The results came a week later. Ethan's hands trembled as he opened his online portal. Finance 201, B+. He exhaled sharply. Not perfect, but solid. As he scrolled, relief flooded him. He had passed everything, not by much. "But enough," Zach smacked his shoulder. "See, I told you." Ethan let out a breathy laugh. He wasn't at the top, but he wasn't at the bottom either. And for now, that was enough. Ethan stared at his laptop screen, the glow of the exam results still illuminating his tired face. He had done okay. Not incredible, not terrible, just okay. And for a second that felt like enough. But then the doubt started creeping back in. Was okay good enough? David had given him an opportunity most people would never get. And instead of excelling, he was just getting by. That thought made his stomach twist. He closed the laptop and rubbed his face. The exhaustion was becoming a permanent state. There was no room to slow down now. Zach flopped into the seat next to him in the library. "All right, dude, we survived midterms. You have to come out tonight." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Come out," Zach grinned. "Yeah, socializing, fun, remember that." Ethan exhaled, already shaking his head. "I don't have time." "Wrong," Zach cut him off. "You don't make time, and it's starting to show. You look like you haven't seen the sun in weeks." Ethan sighed. Zach wasn't wrong, but every minute spent not studying felt like a risk. Zach leaned in. "Look, I get it, but if you burn yourself out, none of this will matter." Ethan hesitated. Maybe just one night. The bar was packed with students, the energy buzzing with post-midterm relief. Ethan nursed a soda while Zach ranted about their impossible economics professor. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt normal. No exams. No stress, just laughter, music, and the hum of life around him. And then a voice behind him. "I almost didn't recognize you out of the library." Ethan turned and froze. It was her, the girl from the restaurant. The one who had spilled the drinks, the one who had been so overwhelmed that night. She smirked. "You remember me?" Ethan blinked. Yeah." She leaned against the counter. "You work there, right?" "Worked," he corrected. Her eyes widened slightly. "Oh." Then, as if piecing it together, she said, "Wait, you're the scholarship guy, aren't you?" Ethan tensed. "Oh, I guess." She grinned. "That's amazing." He wasn't sure what to say. "I'm Lily, by the way," she said. "Ethan." "I know," he chuckled. "Right." She tilted her head. "So how's it been, living the scholarship dream?" Ethan hesitated. Honestly, harder than I expected. Lily nodded. Yeah, that tracks. That surprised him. You don't think it should be easy. She shrugged. Nothing worth it ever is. Ethan studied her for a moment. Maybe she was right. The next few weeks, something changed. Ethan still studied nonstop, still pushed himself harder than ever, but he started making time. Time for Zach. Time for actual meals instead of coffee-fueled all-nighters. And sometimes time for Lily. They ran into each other more after that night, at the library, at the cafe. Once even at the grocery store. Slowly he found himself looking forward to it, looking forward to her. One afternoon, David called again. Ethan answered immediately. David wasted no time. How's it going? Ethan hesitated, then said the truth. I'm keeping up. Barely, but I'm keeping up. David was silent for a moment. Then he said, good. Ethan blinked. Good, David chuckled. You think success means never struggling? Ethan exhaled. I guess I thought I'd be better at this. David's voice softened. You are better, the old you would have quit by now. Ethan frowned. I don't quit. I know, David said. That's why I chose you. Ethan swallowed. The words hit deep, more than he expected, more than he wanted to admit. Finals loomed closer. The library became home again. Ethan didn't just want to pass this time. He wanted to prove something, to David, to himself. To the version of him that had once thought this life was impossible. The night before his biggest exam, he sat across from Lily in the cafe, barely touching his coffee. She studied him. You look like you're about to fight a war. He huffed a laugh. Feels like it. She tilted her head. Ethan, do you ever stop to think about how far you've come? He frowned. What do you mean? She leaned forward. A few months ago, you were working at a restaurant thinking college was impossible. Now you're here on a full ride, grinding your way through one of the best business programs in the country. Ethan swallowed. He never let himself think about that. Because it scared him, because it made everything feel more real. Lily smiled softly. You've already won, now you just have to finish. Ethan exhaled. She made it sound so simple. Maybe it was. Finals week arrived. Ethan barely slept. The tests were brutal, but he kept going, one exam at a time, one step at a time. And when it was over, for the first time in months, he breathed. He had done it. He had finished. And whatever came next, he was ready. Ethan sat at his dorm desk, staring at the email notification on his laptop. Final grades released. His stomach twisted. For months he had been running, pushing himself harder than he ever thought possible. The long nights, the exhaustion, the doubt, it all came down to this. His finger hovered over the trackpad. A deep breath. Then he clicked. The numbers stared back at him. Finance 201, A Business Strategy, B plus Marketing Analytics, A Microeconomics, B. Ethan exhaled, gripping the edge of the desk. He had done it, not just passed. He had earned this, every hour in the library. Every moment of self-doubt. Every time he thought he would fail but pushed through anyway, it had led to this. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He belonged here. A knock on the door made him jump. Zach leaned in. Well, Ethan turned, a slow smile forming. I made it. Zach whooped. I knew it, knew you weren't just some fluke. Ethan chuckled. A fluke. Yeah, maybe he had thought that once too, but not anymore. That evening, Ethan walked through the city, letting the crisp winter air cool his face. The semester was over, and for the first time he didn't feel lost. He had spent so long being afraid of failure that he never let himself think about success. What came next? What did he want? His phone buzzed. David, call me when you're free. Ethan's pulse quickened. He stepped to the side of the busy sidewalk, heart hammering as he hit dial. David picked up instantly. Ethan, hey, Ethan said, trying to sound normal. I got my grades. David chuckled. I know, I already checked. Ethan blinked. You wait, what? David's voice was warm. You did well. Ethan swallowed. Thanks. A pause. Then David said, I have a question for you, Ethan. What do you want to do next? Ethan hesitated. He had spent so much time focusing on getting through school, he hadn't thought about what came after. He exhaled. I want to build something, David hummed. Good answer. Ethan's brow furrowed. Why? David's voice held a smile. Because I have an offer for you. 3 weeks later, Ethan stood in the lobby of a sleek downtown office building, a visitor's badge clipped to his shirt. David had arranged for him to visit one of his companies, a mid-sized startup specializing in sustainable business solutions. Not as an intern, not as a student. As an analyst, an actual job. Ethan couldn't believe it. He had spent his entire life watching people with opportunities he thought he'd never get. Now he was stepping into one himself. A receptionist led him to a glass-walled office where David stood, watching the city below. David turned as Ethan entered. Welcome. Ethan shook his hand firmly. David gestured toward the view. You see that? Ethan followed his gaze. The city stretched endlessly before them, thousands of lights, thousands of lives. David's voice was steady. That's the real world. College is a foundation, but this is where things happen. Ethan nodded. David studied him. Are you ready? Ethan didn't hesitate. Yes, and for the first time in his life, he meant it. 2 years later, Ethan stepped out of a cab in front of his old restaurant. The sign was the same. The smell of grilled food still lingered in the air, but everything felt smaller now. He pushed through the doors. A familiar voice called out. Ethan, David. Ethan grinned. Long time. David waved him over to a booth. You look different. Ethan chuckled. I feel different. He slid into the seat, glancing around. He had worked here for years. Once this place had been his entire world. Now it was just the beginning. David sipped his coffee. So, how's the company? Ethan exhaled, growing fast. David smirked. Good problem to have. Ethan nodded. It was. A problem he never thought he'd get to have. David leaned forward. You know, when I gave you that scholarship, I wasn't just investing in your education. Ethan frowned. Then what? David's gaze was steady. I was investing in you. Ethan swallowed. David continued. And now you're in a position to do the same. Ethan's brows lifted. What do you mean? David smirked. I think you already know. And Ethan did. For the first time, he was the kid waiting for someone to hand him a chance. He was the one giving it. And that was just the start.